The evening of March 14th, 2013, draped the city of Jackson, Mississippi, in a warm, humid embrace, carrying the faint perfume of blooming magnolias through the suburban streets. David Wilson, a 38-year-old man who owned a modest auto repair shop on the edge of town, maneuvered his weathered pickup truck along the familiar route home. His hands gripped the steering wheel with the ease of routine, his thoughts drifting to the dinner awaiting him. His wife, Alice, had always been punctual, setting the table by 7, her quiet dedication a cornerstone of their life together. Their marriage, spanning 15 years, had weathered its share of small quarrels, disagreements over money or David's late nights at the shop. But it held firm, anchored by a shared history and unspoken promises. David, with his quick smile and persuasive charm, had a way of smoothing over tensions, while Alice, patient and nurturing, prioritized their family above all else. Their 2-story home, perched on a quiet street lined with aging oaks, bore the marks of time, peeling paint on the exterior, a sagging porch, yet it stood as a testament to their hard-earned pride, purchased with a hard-fought mortgage after years of saving. The sky had deepened to a dusky purple when David approached the intersection near an ancient oak tree, its gnarled branches casting long shadows across the road. A delivery truck, lumbering through the crossing, misjudged its turn, and David's pickup collided with its side. The impact was minor: a crumpled bumper, a shattered headlight, and a dull ache in David's shoulder where the seatbelt had bitten into his flesh. He stepped out of the truck, his boots crunching against the gravel-strewn asphalt, intending to assess the damage and exchange words with the other driver. But as he stood, a sudden impulse seized him. He clutched his lower back, his face contorting in pain, and collapsed to the ground with a guttural groan. Passers-by gathered, their murmurs blending with the hum of idling engines, and within minutes, an ambulance's wail pierced the evening air. Paramedics lifted David onto a stretcher, his body limp, his eyes half closed as he muttered about numbness in his legs. The scene unfolded with chaotic precision, and David was whisked away to Jackson Memorial Hospital, leaving his truck abandoned under the oak's watchful silhouette. Alice received the call while stirring a pot of collard greens, the phone's ring jolting her from the rhythm of her cooking. The voice on the line, clipped and clinical, informed her of the accident, and her heart lurched. She abandoned the stove, grabbed her purse, and drove to the hospital, her hands trembling on the wheel. The sterile corridors of the emergency ward swallowed her as she hurried to David's side. She found him in a curtained bay, propped up on a gurney, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. Doctors, their expressions guarded, explained that David had sustained trauma to his spine. Preliminary scans suggested severe damage, potentially permanent, though further tests were needed. David, his voice breaking, described a creeping numbness that had overtaken his legs, rendering them useless. Alice stood frozen, her mind struggling to process the weight of the prognosis. She reached for his hand, her fingers intertwining with his, and vowed to stand by him, no matter the cost. Her eyes, brimming with unshed tears, met his, and she saw a flicker of something unreadable. Gratitude, perhaps, or something deeper, more guarded. Weeks passed in a blur of medical appointments and hushed conversations. David remained in the hospital for observation, undergoing scans and consultations that yielded inconclusive results. The doctors, cautious in their assessments, warned that paralysis was likely, though they could not pinpoint the extent of the damage without invasive procedures. David declined. His condition, he claimed, was unmistakable. His legs no longer responded, his lower body a dead weight. The hospital staff, accustomed to such cases, prepared him for discharge, equipping him with a wheelchair and a regimen of medications. Alice, meanwhile, immersed herself in preparations for his return. She quit her job at the school cafeteria, a role she had held for a decade, sacrificing the steady paycheck to become his full-time caregiver. She spent her savings on modifications to their home, transforming the first floor into a space suited for David's new reality. Contractors installed ramps at the front door and widened doorways, while Alice rearranged furniture to accommodate the bulky wheelchair. She studied medical manuals, learning to administer injections and manage catheters, her hands growing steady with practice, despite the ache in her heart. When David returned home in mid-April, he was a shadow of the man Alice had known. The wheelchair seemed to swallow his broad frame, his shoulders slumped under an invisible weight. His once easy smile had vanished, replaced by a vacant stare that rarely met her eyes. He spoke little, his words clipped and heavy with resignation, thanking Alice in a monotone that felt rehearsed. She threw herself into his care with fierce determination, rising before dawn to prepare his meals, bathing him with gentle precision, and guiding him through the house with a patience that masked her exhaustion. Neighbors witnessing her devotion stopped by with casseroles and words of admiration, calling her a saint, a beacon of loyalty. They saw only her strength, not the quiet moments when she stood alone in the kitchen, her hands gripping the counter as she fought back tears. David, for his part, played his role with meticulous care. He winced at imagined pains, let his hands tremble when reaching for a glass, and maintained the facade of a man broken by fate. Yet in fleeting moments when Alice turned away, his eyes followed her, sharp and calculating, as if testing the boundaries of her belief. The accident, though minor, had fractured more than metal. It had introduced a subtle dissonance into their lives, a crack too fine to see but deep enough to unsettle the foundation of their marriage. Alice, consumed by her commitment, failed to notice the inconsistencies, the way David's fingers lingered on the armrests of his chair, steady and strong, or the occasional twitch of his foot when he thought himself unobserved. She attributed his silences to grief, his irritability to pain, never questioning the narrative he had woven. David, meanwhile, settled into his deception with a quiet resolve, his mind already turning toward the possibilities his new life afforded. The neighborhood, unaware of the truth, continued to offer sympathy, their pity a shield that protected David's secret. The old oak at the intersection stood sentinel, its roots buried deep in the earth, a silent witness to the moment that had changed everything. By 2023, the rhythm of the Wilson household had settled into a grueling routine, steeped in exhaustion and unspoken sacrifice. Alice, now 50, carried the weight of a decade's toil on her frame. Deep lines etched her forehead, and streaks of gray wove through her once dark hair, betraying years of relentless caregiving. Her hands, once soft and nimble from tending her garden, had grown calloused, their skin roughened by the endless tasks of lifting, cleaning, and tending to her husband. Each morning she rose at 5, the pre-dawn quiet broken only by the creak of floorboards as she moved to the kitchen. She prepared David's breakfast, oatmeal or eggs, always soft foods he could manage without strain, before assisting him with the morning rituals of bathing and dressing. With practiced care, she eased him from the bed to his wheelchair, her movements precise despite the ache in her shoulders. The day unfolded in a blur of activity, pushing David through the neighborhood park under the sprawling oaks, reading aloud from worn paperbacks, or adjusting pillows to ease his supposed discomfort. Evenings brought the futile task of massaging his legs, a ritual she performed despite the doctor's assurances that no sensation remained below his waist. She clung to the hope that her touch might spark some miracle, though her faith in such possibilities had long since faded. The financial strain pressed heavily on their lives. David's disability benefits, a modest monthly sum from the state, covered little beyond the basics. Medical bills from the early years had piled up, and Alice had sold their old van, a rusty relic of happier times, to settle the most pressing debts. The garden she once loved, where roses and jasmine had bloomed under her care, now lay barren, overtaken by weeds. She had abandoned her hobbies, her dreams of opening a flower shop, and even her friendships, which withered under the demands of her role as David's caregiver. The neighbors who once dropped by with gossip and laughter now kept their distance, their visits replaced by occasional sympathetic nods. Alice bore it all with a stoic resolve, her love for David a tether that held her to this life, even as it drained her spirit. David, in contrast, had adapted to his role with an ease that bordered on complacency. He spent his days stationed by the living room window, the sunlight filtering through dusty curtains to illuminate the pages of car magazines he flipped through absently. His once vibrant presence had dimmed, his broad shoulders hunched in the wheelchair, his eyes often fixed on some distant point. On rare occasions, he summoned the energy to jest, recounting stories of their early years, nights at the local diner or impromptu road trips along the Mississippi River. But these moments were fleeting, overshadowed by long stretches of silence that seemed to swallow the room. Alice noticed a growing edge to his demeanor, a sharpness that surfaced when she broached topics of the future. Plans for downsizing the house or seeking new treatments. He would snap, his voice laced with bitterness, accusing her of failing to grasp the depth of his suffering. She absorbed his words, attributing them to the pain of his condition, never suspecting the truth that lay beneath. Unbeknownst to Alice, David's nights were far from the helpless slumber she imagined. When the house fell silent and her breathing deepened in sleep, he rose from their bed with the stealth of a man unburdened by injury. His legs, which he claimed were numb, carried him effortlessly across the hardwood floors. He moved through the darkened rooms, his steps deliberate, checking bills tucked in a drawer or retrieving a small tin box hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the pantry. Inside the box, he kept a growing stash of cash, savings siphoned from the disability checks, meticulously counted under the glow of a flashlight. His back, supposedly shattered, held firm as he crouched or stretched, betraying no hint of pain. The accident, a minor collision that should have faded into memory, had become his liberation. By convincing doctors, insurers, and Alice of his paralysis, he had secured a life free of labor, his days unencumbered by the grind of the auto shop. The lie was his shield, and he guarded it with a vigilance that never wavered. Only one person harbored doubts about David's condition. Melvin, their neighbor and a former colleague from the repair shop, carried a quiet skepticism that set him apart. A grizzled mechanic with a penchant for homemade pecan pies, he visited sporadically, his heavy footsteps echoing on the porch as he delivered a foil-covered dish. His eyes lingered on David during these visits, searching for cracks in the facade. Once, while Alice busied herself in the kitchen, Melvin caught a fleeting movement, a subtle shift of David's foot against the wheelchair's rest, too deliberate to be a reflex. He mentioned it to Alice later, his tone cautious, suggesting she keep a closer eye on her husband. But Alice, her loyalty unshaken, dismissed the observation with a wave, accusing Melvin of seeing things that weren't there. Her rebuke stung, and Melvin retreated, though his unease lingered. David, alerted to the old man's scrutiny, redoubled his caution. He avoided Melvin's visits, feigning sleep or discomfort when the mechanic knocked, and sharpened his performance, ensuring every gesture reinforced the illusion of his disability. The years had woven a delicate web of deception, its threads invisible to all but David. Alice, consumed by her duties, failed to notice the small inconsistencies, the way David's wheelchair tracks never quite matched the paths she expected, or the faint creak of floorboards in the night she attributed to the house settling. She saw only the man she loved, broken by fate, and poured herself into his care, unaware that each act of devotion tightened the noose of his betrayal. The neighborhood, too, remained oblivious, their pity for the Wilsons a constant hum that drowned out any whispers of doubt. The old oak at the intersection, its roots deeper now than a decade ago, stood as a silent marker of the moment that had set this lie in motion, its branches swaying gently in the Mississippi breeze, indifferent to the truth buried beneath the surface. The spring of 2023 arrived in Jackson, Mississippi, with a gentle warmth, the air thick with the scent of budding dogwoods and the hum of early cicadas. On the morning of March 12th, Alice stood at the kitchen sink, her hands submerged in soapy water as she scrubbed a frying pan, her mind heavy with the weight of unpaid bills. The electricity company had sent a final notice, and the modest sum from David's disability checks offered no reprieve. Determined to ease their financial strain, she resolved to clear out the garage, a cluttered repository of David's old belongings from his days at the auto shop. She hoped to find his tools, wrenches, socket sets, perhaps a drill, items she could sell to cover the overdue account. The garage, a dim space smelling of oil and dust, stood separate from the house, its sagging wooden door groaning as she forced it open. Inside, cardboard boxes and rusted equipment lay stacked in haphazard piles, relics of a life before the accident that had reshaped their world. Alice worked methodically, sorting through the chaos with a single-minded focus. She pushed aside crates of faded invoices and broken car parts, her fingers brushing against cobwebs that clung to her skin. Near the back, beneath a tarp stiff with grime, she uncovered a small metal box, its surface pitted with rust but secured with a sturdy padlock. The box was unfamiliar, its presence jarring in the sea of David's known possessions. She searched the nearby shelves for a key, rifling through jars of screws and tangled extension cords, but found nothing. A flicker of curiosity, tinged with unease, stirred within her. She retrieved a screwdriver from a nearby toolbox and, with a determined twist, pried open the lock, the metal giving way with a sharp snap. Inside, neatly arranged, were documents. A stack of medical records dated 2013, their edges yellowed, in a single folded letter bearing the letterhead of Jackson Memorial Hospital. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the letter, her eyes scanning the typed words. The physician, a Dr. Hargrove, stated that David's spinal injury from the accident was minor, a contusion at most, insufficient to cause paralysis. The prognosis was clear. Full recovery was expected within weeks. Alice's breath caught, her pulse hammering in her ears. She read the letter again, searching for a misinterpretation, but the words remained unyielding. The discovery sent a chill through her, rooting her to the spot as the garage's shadows seemed to close in. She clutched the letter, her mind racing to reconcile its contents with the decade of care she had devoted to David. The medical records corroborated the letter, detailing initial scans that showed no significant damage, yet David had insisted on his paralysis, his claims unchallenged by follow-up tests he had refused. Alice folded the documents and returned them to the box, her movements mechanical as she replaced it beneath the tarp. She could not confront David, not yet. The weight of the revelation was too raw, her trust in him too deeply ingrained to shatter in a single moment. She left the garage, the screwdriver still clutched in her hand, and returned to the house. Her face composed, but her thoughts in turmoil. Throughout the day, Alice observed David with a new scrutiny, her eyes tracing his every movement for signs of deceit. He sat in his wheelchair by the living room window, a magazine open on his lap, his fingers resting lightly on the pages. His motions, once pitiable, now struck her as rehearsed. The way he shifted his weight with calculated slowness, the deliberate limpness of his hands when he reached for a glass of water. She recalled fleeting moments over the years that had puzzled her. A soft thud in the hallway one night, dismissed as the cat knocking over a book. The faint scuff marks on the kitchen floor, attributed to her own carelessness. These fragments, once insignificant, now coalesced into a haunting pattern. David's performance, she realized, was too polished, his helplessness too consistent to be genuine. Yet doubt lingered, a stubborn remnant of her love, urging her to believe she had misunderstood the documents, that some explanation could restore the man she thought she knew. Determined to test her suspicions, Alice devised a plan. That evening, as the sky darkened to a deep indigo, she announced she was visiting their neighbor Melvin to borrow a recipe. David nodded absently, his eyes fixed on the television's flickering screen. Alice stepped outside, letting the front door close with a deliberate click. But instead of crossing the street, she slipped back into the house through the side entrance. She crept to the narrow closet beneath the staircase, a cramped space filled with coats and forgotten umbrellas, and eased the door shut, leaving a sliver of a gap to peer through. Her heart pounded as she waited, the silence of the house broken only by the distant drone of the television. Nearly an hour passed, her legs cramping in the confined space, before she heard it, a soft creak followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were cautious but firm, not the shuffle of a man reliant on a wheelchair. Holding her breath, Alice peered through the gap and saw David standing in the living room, his silhouette framed against the window's faint glow. He gazed out at the street, his posture upright, his legs steady beneath him. The sight struck her like a physical blow, her hand flying to her mouth to stifle a gasp. 10 years of her life, her sacrifices, her exhaustion, her unwavering devotion, crumbled in that moment, exposed as a lie woven by the man she had loved. Alice remained in the closet until David returned to his wheelchair, his movements swift and silent as he resumed his charade. Only then did she emerge, her body trembling with a mix of shock and betrayal. She slipped out of the house and walked to Melvin's, her mind a storm of fragmented memories and unanswered questions. The night air did little to cool the heat of her realization, and as she stood on Melvin's porch, pretending to chat about recipes, she knew her world had shifted irrevocably. The truth, once a distant shadow, had stepped into the light, and Alice could no longer ignore its presence. The days following Alice's discovery passed in a haze of muted anguish, each moment steeped in the bitter realization of David's betrayal. She continued her duties as his caregiver, her hands moving through the familiar tasks of preparing meals, adjusting his wheelchair, and tending to his needs. But every gesture carried a weight of pain. Her eyes, once softened by love, now saw deception in David's every motion. She noticed the calculated way he let a spoon slip from his fingers, forcing her to stoop and retrieve it, or the exaggerated grimace he wore when claiming phantom pains in his legs. These acts, once invisible beneath her devotion, now stood out as cruel taunts, mocking the decades she had sacrificed to his supposed helplessness. Her life, once filled with dreams of a flower shop blooming with roses and lilies, had withered to the confines of his wheelchair. Her friends faded to distant memories, her world reduced to the endless cycle of his care. Sleep eluded her, the nights spent lying beside the man who had exploited her trust, her mind replaying the image of him standing by the living room window, his legs betraying the lie she had believed for 10 years. Anger took root within her, a relentless weed choking out the last vestiges of pity. Determined to uncover the full extent of David's deceit, Alice turned her attention to the house, seeking further evidence of his treachery. She chose a morning when David dozed in his chair, the television casting a flickering glow across his face, to slip into the basement. The space was damp and cluttered, its concrete floor strewn with old boxes and forgotten furniture, the air heavy with the musty scent of neglect. She moved quietly, her flashlight cutting through the gloom as she sifted through the debris. In a corner, behind a stack of warped cardboard, she found a small wooden crate, its lid secured with a rusty latch. Inside lay a thick envelope stuffed with cash, crisp bills meticulously bundled, far more than their meager budget could account for. Beside it was a notebook, its pages filled with David's precise handwriting, detailing monthly deposits from his disability checks, alongside calculations of savings amassed over years. The numbers were a stark indictment, proof that he had hoarded wealth while she sold their van to pay medical bills. Tucked beneath the notebook was an old flip phone, its screen cracked but functional, one David had claimed to lose years ago. Her hands shook as she powered it on, the device humming to life to reveal a series of text messages from 2014. The recipient was an attorney named Clarkson, and the exchanges outlined David's strategy to convince the insurance company of his permanent disability, securing higher payouts through carefully worded claims. Each message struck like a hammer, confirming that his lie was not a spur-of-the-moment deception, but a calculated scheme crafted from the moment of the accident. The revelations fueled a transformation in Alice's anger, turning it from a smoldering ember into something darker, more consuming. She returned the items to the crate, her movements deliberate, and climbed the basement stairs, her resolve hardening with each step. In the days that followed, she went through the motions of caregiving, but her thoughts churned with visions of retribution. She imagined confronting David, shoving him from his wheelchair to expose his fraud, or screaming the truth until her voice gave out. But these fantasies, vivid as they were, felt insufficient. He had stolen a decade of her life, her dreams, her identity, and no mere confrontation could balance the scales. The idea of justice took shape one sleepless night as she sat in the living room, her gaze fixed on an old kerosene lamp that rested on the mantel. Its glass chimney glinted in the moonlight, a relic from their early marriage, and in its quiet presence she saw a solution. Fire. It was relentless, indiscriminate, capable of erasing everything in its path, leaving no trace of the past. The thought took hold, its simplicity both terrifying and alluring, and Alice began to plan. She moved with caution, her actions cloaked in the guise of normalcy. At the local hardware store, she purchased a 5-gallon canister of gasoline, explaining to the clerk that it was for a neighbor's lawnmower. She carried it home under the cover of dusk, the weight of the canister pulling at her arms as she stowed it in the garage behind a pile of old tires. She studied David's habits with renewed intensity, noting how deeply he slept after taking the snot-vorny tablets she administered each evening. The pills prescribed to ease his supposed nerve pain rendered him oblivious, his breathing heavy, and even within minutes of swallowing them. Alice tested their effect, doubling the dose one night and watching as he sank into a stupor, unresponsive to the creak of the floorboards or the clatter of a dropped book. The knowledge gave her confidence, a grim assurance that her plan could succeed. She memorized the layout of the house, tracing the paths where flames would spread fastest. The wooden floors, the threadbare curtains, the stacks of newspapers David left scattered in the living room. Each detail solidified her intent, her anger forging a path toward an act she could no longer resist. Alice's transformation was invisible to David, who remained secure in his deception. He continued his performance, unaware of the shift in her gaze, the way her hands lingered a moment too long when adjusting his blanket, or the faint tremor in her fingers as she handed him his pills. The neighborhood, too, saw only the familiar tableau of their lives. Alice, the devoted wife, and David, the tragic figure confined to his chair. But within Alice, a fire already burned, its heat growing with each passing day, waiting for the moment to consume the lie that had defined her existence. On March 15th, 2023, exactly 10 years after the accident that had redefined their lives, Alice crossed the threshold of her resolve. The day unfolded with a deceptive normalcy, her actions cloaked in the routine she had perfected over a decade. She rose at dawn, the Mississippi air heavy with the promise of rain, and prepared David's breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, arranged carefully on a tray. She guided him from bed to wheelchair with the same practiced gentleness, her hands steady despite the storm within her. As David grumbled about the overcast sky, she offered a faint smile, her face a mask of compliance. The hours passed in a blur of familiar tasks, wiping down the kitchen counters, adjusting the cushions behind David's back, fetching a glass of water he barely touched. Each act was a deliberate performance, a final rehearsal for the irrevocable step she had chosen. By evening, as the sky darkened to a bruised purple, she prepared his tea, her fingers steady as she crushed 2 extra tablets of snot vorney into the steaming liquid. David drank it without suspicion, his eyes half closed as he muttered about a headache. Within minutes, he slumped into the bed on the first floor, his breathing deep and rhythmic, oblivious to the fate awaiting him. Alice waited until midnight, the house enveloped in a stillness broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the living room. She moved with a quiet purpose, her footsteps muffled against the worn hardwood floors. From the garage, she retrieved the gasoline canister, its weight familiar from the night she had hidden it. The sharp, acrid scent of fuel filled her nostrils as she unscrewed the cap, her hands steady despite the pounding of her heart. She began in the living room, pouring the liquid in slow, deliberate arcs across the threadbare rug, the faded curtains, and the wooden coffee table strewn with David's magazines. The gasoline soaked into the fabric, darkening it, and pooled in shallow puddles on the floor. She moved to the hallway, dousing the baseboards and the staircase, then circled back to the kitchen, where the linoleum glistened under the slick coating. The dining room, with its chipped table and mismatched chairs, received the same treatment, the fuel seeping into the cracks of the wooden floorboards. She worked methodically, her movements almost ceremonial, as if consecrating the house for its final act. The air grew thick with the pungent odor, a warning she ignored as she ensured every corner bore the mark of her intent. With the house prepared, Alice approached David's bedside, the canister now empty at her feet. He lay motionless, his face softened in sleep, the lines of his features almost boyish, untainted by the deceit that defined him. She stood over him, her gaze tracing the contours of the man she had loved, the man who had stolen a decade of her life. Memories surged unbidden, years of lifting his weight, of abandoning her dreams, of believing in a lie that had consumed her. She saw herself tending the garden that no longer bloomed, her hands once stained with soil now rough from his care. The urge to wake him, to confront him with the truth flickered briefly, a spark of the woman she had been. But she extinguished it. Words were insufficient. He deserved to awaken in the hell he had created. She turned away, her decision absolute, and walked to the living room window, where the old curtains hung limp and dry. From her pocket she drew a lighter, its metal cool against her palm. With a single flick, she ignited the flame and held it to the fabric. The fire caught instantly, a hungry orange tongue licking upward, spreading with a ferocity that mirrored her own resolve. The flames roared to life, consuming the curtains and leaping to the walls, the gasoline ensuring their rapid advance. The wooden beams of the house, aged and dry, crackled under the heat, sending sparks cascading to the floor. Alice retreated to the hallway, her eyes stinging from the thickening smoke. She closed the door to David's bedroom, its hinges creaking in protest, and wedged a heavy dining chair beneath the knob, its legs scraping against the floor. The act was final, a seal on his fate. Through the door she heard the first signs of disturbance, a ragged cough, a muffled groan as David stirred from his drug-induced slumber. The cough turned to a scream, raw and desperate, as he realized the inferno encircling him. The sound clawed at her, but she remained rooted, her back pressed against the wall, the heat of the fire warming her skin through the door. The screams grew frantic, accompanied by the thud of his body against the locked barrier. But the chair held firm. Smoke began to seep into the hallway, curling around her like a living thing, and only then did Alice move. She stumbled toward the front door, her lungs burning, and burst into the cool night air, collapsing onto the grass as the house blazed behind her. The neighborhood awoke to the chaos, windows glowing with the fire's eerie light. Neighbors spilled onto their lawns, their shouts mingling with the crackle of flames. Someone called the fire department, and sirens wailed in the distance. But Alice remained still, seated on the damp grass, her eyes fixed on the house as it transformed into a towering pyre. The roof sagged, beams collapsing in showers of embers, and the windows shattered, releasing plumes of black smoke into the sky. Firefighters arrived, their hoses unleashing torrents of water. But the blaze was too fierce, the house too far gone. They found David's body later in the charred remains of the bedroom, his form contorted in a final agonized struggle. Alice watched the scene unfold, her face expressionless, as if the fire had burned away not only the house but the last traces of her soul. When the police approached, their flashlights cutting through the darkness, she offered no resistance. Her wrists accepted the cold bite of handcuffs, and she walked to the squad car in silence, her gaze empty, the weight of her retribution complete. The morning of March 16, 2023, found Alice seated on a hard metal bench in a holding cell at the Jackson police station, the air heavy with the scent of disinfectant and stale coffee. Her arrest had ignited a firestorm of attention across the city, the story of a devoted wife who burned her disabled husband alive, seizing the front pages of local newspapers. Reporters swarmed the station, their cameras flashing through the barred windows, eager to capture the face of a woman transformed into a symbol of betrayal and vengeance. The details of the fire, its ferocity, the locked bedroom door, David's charred remains, fueled lurid headlines, painting Alice as both villain and enigma. Yet beneath the sensationalism, fragments of truth began to emerge, rising like ash carried on a restless wind. Melvin, the Wilsons' neighbor, stepped forward with a quiet resolve, his weathered hands delivering a piece of evidence that shifted the narrative. He presented a grainy video from a security camera mounted above his garage, recorded a year prior. The footage captured David, under the cover of night, walking confidently to his pickup truck, his steps sure and unhindered, a stark contradiction to the paralyzed man he claimed to be. Investigators descended on the smoldering ruins of the Wilson home, their boots crunching through the debris as they sifted for clues. Amid the blackened timbers and melted remnants of furniture, they uncovered the scorched remains of the metal box Alice had found in the garage. Though fire had claimed much of its contents, a few documents survived, their edges curled but legible. The letter from Dr. Hargrove, outlining David's minimal spinal injury, lay among them, its words a damning testament to his deception. Alongside it were fragments of text messages printed from the old phone, detailing his correspondence with an attorney to inflate his insurance claims, and scraps of a notebook listing his secret savings. These relics, though incomplete, painted a clear picture of a man who had orchestrated a decade-long lie, exploiting his wife's devotion for financial gain. The evidence did little to alter Alice's legal fate, but it provided a lens through which to understand her actions, a glimpse into the motive that had driven her to such an extreme. During her interrogation, conducted in a stark room with peeling paint and a flickering fluorescent light, Alice broke her silence. Seated across from a detective whose face betrayed a mix of pity and disapproval, she spoke in a voice devoid of emotion, mechanical in its precision. She recounted the moment she found the metal box, the letter that shattered her trust, and the night she saw David standing, his betrayal laid bare. She described the suffocating weight of her life, reduced to a prison of caregiving, her dreams and identity erased by his manipulation. The fire, she explained, had been her only escape, a desperate act to reclaim the years stolen from her. She offered no apologies, no pleas for leniency, her gaze fixed on a point beyond the room, as if staring into the void left by her actions. The detective scribbled notes, his pen scratching against the paper. But Alice's words carried a finality that required no further probing. Her confession was not a defense but a declaration, an acknowledgement of the cost she had paid and the price she had exacted. The trial that followed was swift, the courtroom packed with spectators drawn by the case's grim allure. Prosecutors presented the fire as a calculated act of murder, emphasizing the locked door and the double dose of snot-vorny, while Alice's attorney argued that her actions stemmed from years of psychological torment. The jury, swayed by the evidence of premeditation, returned a verdict of guilty, and the judge sentenced Alice to life in prison without parole. She stood motionless as the gavel fell, her face impassive, the weight of her sentence settling like dust. In the women's correctional facility outside Jackson, she carved out a solitary existence, her days marked by the clang of cell doors and the murmur of distant voices. She declined visits from journalists, whose letters promised exposés, and rebuffed attorneys offering appeals, their optimism clashing with her resignation. Her cell, a narrow space with a single window, became her world, its concrete walls a mirror of the emptiness within her. Melvin remained her sole connection to the outside, his visits a quiet ritual in the prison's sterile visiting room. He brought small gifts, a bar of soap, a dog-eared novel, his presence a reminder of the life she had left behind. During one visit, as rain streaked the windows, he asked if she regretted what she had done, his voice soft with concern. Alice met his gaze, her eyes hollow, and said she had burned not only David but herself, the words carrying the weight of a truth she had long accepted. Melvin nodded, his silence a gesture of understanding, and left her to the solitude she seemed to crave. Her story, meanwhile, wove itself into Jackson's folklore, debated in diners and church basements. Some branded her a monster, a woman who had forsaken morality for vengeance. Others saw her as a victim, broken by a betrayal too profound to bear. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between, its edges blurred by the passage of time. Years crept by, and the Wilson home remained a skeletal ruin, its blackened frame overtaken by kudzu and thistle. Local children avoided the lot, their whispers claiming David's screams echoed in the wind, a ghostly remnant of that fateful night. The community moved on, new scandals eclipsing the tragedy, but the story lingered, a cautionary tale of love twisted by deception. Alice, confined within her cell, carried the burden of her actions, her mind replaying the fire's roar, the locked door, the moment she chose retribution over redemption. Her vengeance had dismantled David's lie, exposing the truth to a world that judged her for it, but it had also consumed her, leaving only ashes where her spirit once thrived. The oak at the intersection, its branches heavier with each passing season, stood as a silent witness, its roots entwined with the secrets of a decade, indifferent to the justice or ruin it had seen unfold.